I want to give you a little bit of background on the Vietnam War before you read the things they carried. This short story, which is actually taken from a larger work, a novel by the same name by Tim O'Brien, is set in the Vietnam War and involves a platoon of soldiers. So I just thought it was important that you know a little bit about um, the events surrounding the time that this short story was written and that these characters were fighting in this war. Um, this is certainly not a comprehensive discussion. In fact, there are entire classes offered just on the Vietnam War. But I am going to try to hit some of the highlights for you just to give you a good understanding of the context. The Vietnam War occurred in present-day Vietnam, which is in Southeast Asia, and it represented a successful attempt on the part of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the North Vietnamese, and the National Front for the Liberation of Vietnam, and that group, in short, was called the Viet Cong, to unite and impose a communist system over the entire nation. Opposing these two groups was the Republic of Vietnam, and these were the South Vietnamese. And this group was backed by the United States. So you had the North Vietnam that was wanting to impose communism and was supported by the Soviet Union, fighting the South Vietnamese, which wanted to maintain or wanted to push back against that and who was supported by the United States. Because this war occurred during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's generally viewed as a proxy war or an indirect conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, with each nation and its allies supporting a particular side. So here we have two superpowers fighting a proxy war in a tiny country in Southeast Asia. And here is the map, and you can see where Vietnam is located, right on the edge of the South China Sea, China to the north, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. So that kind of gives you a general geographic understanding. The United States' involvement and responsibility for this war passed through three different presidents. The most commonly used dates for the conflict are 1959 to 1975, but the U.S. did not get directly involved until 1965 and remained involved until 1973. John Kennedy, during his presidency, was committed to stop communism at any cost. So what he did was support the South Vietnamese trying to stop the spread of communism. And Kennedy's plan and what he carried out was to train the army of the South Vietnamese and provide military advisors to their leader in hopes that they could fight this war without direct U.S. troop involvement. Significantly, the South Vietnamese leader was assassinated just 20 days before JFK was assassinated in 1963. So their concept of war in Vietnam transferred to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was vice president when Kennedy died, and so he became president and took over the war. So a significant thing happened in August of 1964. There were U.S. troops patrolling out here in the Gulf of Tonkin Remember, there were no U.S. troops on the ground at this point, but there was a military presence in the Gulf of Tonkin. And there was a very suspicious attack that these warships thought was made on them by the North Vietnamese. Now, there were two such attacks. The first attack was actually confirmed, but the second one was not. And both ended up being just weather-related issues. However, they were taken seriously by enough people to believe that the North Vietnamese had fired on these American patrol ships. What this enabled then was the passage by Congress of the Southeast Asia Resolution, which is also referred to as the Tonkin Resolution. And this allowed President Johnson to conduct military operations in Vietnam without a declaration of war. So that is a significant move by Congress. So this was an unsanctioned conflict, which began to create all kinds of problems in the United States and with different factions of people in the United States. So in August, the U.S. began retaliatory attacks. In March of 1965, in what was called Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. began bombing targets in Vietnam, and the first ground troops arrived. And during the summer of 1965, U.S. troops won victories over the North Vietnamese forces that summer. U.S. was convinced that all was going well. So all seemed to be going okay. Until the North Vietnamese started avoiding fighting conventional battles. And they started engaging troops in small unit actions in the sweltering jungles of South Vietnam. This is the setting of the things they carried. So from the Operation Rolling Thunder for 2.5 years until what is known as the Tet Offensive, the battles took place in small unit actions. And so that will be the setting for our story, as I said. In January of 1968, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. And what the Tet Offensive was multiple simultaneous attacks on U.S. and South Vietnamese troops simultaneously. Tet undoubtedly shook the confidence of the American people and the media, who thought the war was going well. And this really changed the whole perception of this war and why we had troops there for many, many people in the United States. As a result of Tet, Johnson does not seek re-election, and then Richard Nixon became president. His plan for ending U.S. involvement was similar to Kennedy's. He wanted to build up the South Vietnamese so that they could fight the war themselves. And this process was called Vietnamization. And as this process began, U.S. troops started to return home. But it was a very, very slow return home. It wasn't until 1974 that a peace accord was finally signed in Paris, ending the conflict. By March of 1974, American combat troops had left the country. But after a very, very short period of peace, North Vietnam recommenced hostilities in late 1974. They captured the capital of South Vietnam, which is Saigon, on April 30th, 1975, and this forced Vietnam's surrender and it reunited the country. So basically, once the treaty was signed and the U.S. troops pulled out, the country fell to the North Vietnamese anyway. But during those periods of time, and this is one of the reasons this war is so controversial, in addition to the fact of the Tonkin Resolution, these were the casualties. These were the people that died, that were wounded, and that were missing in action. So millions of people. This war was full of paradoxes. In the name of protecting democracy, the U.S. propped up a dictatorial regime in South Vietnam. The U.S. military was destroying villages in order to, quote, save them from communists. And because U.S. objectives were often poorly defined during the course of the war, U.S. policy often made no sense. The Vietnam War is one of the most problematic of all of the wars in American history. And it was all of these things, and this is one of the reasons it sparked so many protests, which you can see here. So many protests while politicians were doing their thing, and then young troops were fighting and dying. It was considered a morally ambiguous conflict. There was no real reason for the United States to get involved. It was a war against communism and Russia by proxy. And it was a war to suppress national self-determination. And then the question people asked then and continue to ask today is, was it worth it? This war had tremendous impact on American society and culture, in large part because it was the first American war to be played out in the media, which is often openly opposed to our involvement in Vietnam. And so you get pictures like this flooding American papers and news outlets that portrayed our soldiers as inhumane and portrayed tactical victories as defeats. So it was a very, very complicated. All of these photographs and videos and opinions of American journalists, coupled with the simple fact that young Americans were dying on foreign soil against an enemy that did not threaten the United States, turned much of the American public against this war. Really, by the time of the Tet Offensive, the anti-war movement in the U.S. had been in full swing for quite some time. The post-World War II baby boom had produced an especially large youth generation who, thanks to post-war prosperity, were attending college in large numbers. So not surprisingly, a large student protest movement emerged as U.S. involvement in Vietnam grew. So one of the things that was so difficult for these young soldiers fighting in this war was that, unlike today, when we welcome our troops home with open arms for wherever they've been around the world, this wasn't always the case. So you had soldiers fighting in jungles without clear direction, without really knowing who their enemy was. And yet when they came home, they were often spat at, they were often ridiculed, they were not welcome. So it's a very, very complicated war and a complicated situation. And what Tim O'Brien does so well, having served in Vietnam himself, is through this short story, he puts us in the position of the soldier and what it was like to fight these battles in jungles without really knowing where the enemy was at many times. So I hope that you enjoy reading the story. I think you will find it interesting. And then we will discuss aspects of that in the next video after you read the story.